I am?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm recording.
You know Ruth Heckner?
No, I don't know her.
You know her?
I know who she is.
No, offer.
I am recording, gentlemen.
Okay.
Just to let you know, you can talk about it whatever you want. It's just the whole internet's going to know.
That's the one.
Okay. Okay, gentlemen. We are in the middle of Perek Ches. We're in the middle of chapter 8 of the Tzemach Tzedek's famous discourse, Mitzvahs Hamanas Elokus, explaining the commandment to have faith in God. Faith in God consists of many things, and we've been discussing many of the details with regards to what can be understood, what cannot be understood. What does it mean that there are aspects of godliness which can be known rather than and certain aspects which can only be attached to or grasped through faith? But that's all the much broader conversation. In the more narrow conversation, we've been answering certain philosophical or theological questions about God using the framework of the Arizal and the Ramak as explained in Chassidus, using the framework of the great Kabbalists, of the 10 spheres, of the notion of godliness, that there is a realm that is an expression of God, a godly expression that is neither a creation nor the creator, and that this realm is the key to understanding not just the process by which God creates the world, but also the way by which we relate to God and God relates to us, and anything in the limited reality at all. Now, the question we really set out to answer first, which is really a question that the Rambam had and a question that the Maharal had, and we've dealt with it at great length. The first question was, how can it be that God has knowledge? How can it be that God knows anything, right? The truth is that it doesn't have to be knowledge. The truth is that it could be any trait, any God. It could be about God's love for the same price. But for various reasons, we talk about knowledge. It has to do with, the question was originally posed for our purposes by the Rambam, who was very interested in thinking of God as a being of intellect, as we've mentioned in previous classes, that God himself is his knowledge. God himself is in some sense seichel, although in a very abstract and removed way, that God is a being of intellect. So we ended up talking about knowledge rather than any of the other traits, although the other traits have worked their way back in as well. And basically what we ended up explaining was to the answer to question, how can God have knowledge, right? The question was, if God has a knowledge, then that means that number one, God changes over time with his knowledge of the world. The world changes over time, his knowledge changes. God, who is supposed to be unaffected and before whom the world is supposed to be nothing, can actually be changed through his knowledge, changed over time. And we explained further that not only is change over time a problem, but even having the knowledge itself is a problem, because having the knowledge, as we've been explained, if his knowledge is like human knowledge, or if his knowledge is separate from him in any way, which according to the Kabbalah it basically is, his essence is not one with his knowledge. He is not his knowledge. The Rambam's solution to this whole problem was to say that God is his knowledge, and his knowledge is him, and the two can't be separated in any way. This is not the Kabbalistic solution. The Kabbalistic solution to this problem is that God has a knowledge that's separate than him. So then the problem is not only that it changes over time, but also that the knowledge itself is a problem, even if it doesn't change. Even if God were to know everything that didn't change, it would be a problem, because the knowledge implies a multiplicity within God. There's a division, which means that there's God and his knowledge now, and then the question becomes, well, how do these two things interact? What is the system that they cause? What is the system that causes them? How do these two things exist, so to speak, in a system? It can't be that God is God if he has a knowledge which is separate from him, etc., etc. The way we answered this question is that God's knowledge is not God himself. It's not part of God himself, and it's not a creation. Rather, God's knowledge is an expression of him, and it's an expression of him in a very specific Kabbalistic way. It's his it's his light. And the light also interacts with something else called a kli, which is called a vessel. And through the light, through understanding, which we spent at least 2 chapters on, trying to understand the light and the vessel, we've come to understand how it's possible It's something we've struggled with, and the truth is that we can't really fully understand these things. These things are very, very difficult to understand. But we've explained it as, at least in a very superficial, at least at a beginner's level, we've explained how it's possible that there's an expression of God, which is an expression but does not change him. An expression of him that changes, that is his knowledge and his wisdom, but that does not change him. And that's basically the answer to the question. How can God have knowledge if the knowledge changes? The answer is that God does not change, but the knowledge changes. And the knowledge is an expression of him. The knowledge is not him himself.
But the light in Kabbalah is called mochin. This is mochin.
What is?
The light.
The light is not called. Where is the light called mochin?
Mochin is the light. It's the godly light. It's the godly knowledge.
As opposed to?
Not as opposed to.
So,
So, this is the analogy.
The mochin is just one of the spheres. There's also midas. There's also other things that exist in the godly light. So the godly light, this godly expression is this very hard to understand concept, but we did our best, at least at the beginner level, to understand what this means. And it turns out that God has a knowledge that is not one with him, that is not a creation, but is rather an expression of him. And this knowledge can change. This knowledge is what the world affects. When something changes in the world and God knows it, in some sense, really there's two types of knowledge, which we're going to get to in a minute. But in when we say God knows, like for example, very famously, that God heard the cries of Sodom, of the city of Sodom, and then he decided to descend and destroy it, right? In other words, when God knows in this active way, when God knows and then reacts, which really the reaction is the topic of our chapter, right? When God knows and reacts to this information, this knowledge takes place within the spheres. This knowledge takes place within the godly expression, but not God himself. Before God, as we know, we have a principle, as we've spoken about before. We actually have multiple principles that are all sort of different ways of saying very similar things. One of them is Ani Havaya Lo Shanisi, that I, God, does not change. The creation of the world does not change God at all. Right, so God himself is not affected by knowledge of the creation. There's also, as we've emphasized more in this chapter, there's also Kula Kamei Kaloi Chashiv. Everything before him is irrelevant or as nothing. In other words, that he has no investment in everything that takes place within our world. The world may as well not exist with regards to him. This is all with regards to his essence. At his essence, God himself. This is all true. He does not change. The knowledge of the world does not affect him. All the changes that take place are within his expression, are within the godly light, are within the spheres, are within what we call godliness, as opposed to God.
But then, based on what you said,
yes,
the spirit have independent thinking.
No. The whole point, inherent in the notion of light and inherent in the notion of vessel, as we've been explaining them at great length, these things are not independent of God. These things are expressions of God. It's the opposite of independence, the definition of dependence. The notion of dependence was almost literally invented to describe these things.
But then he does know what's going on.
So we have further questions. So there's you could ask this question in multiple ways. This isn't really in our mimer, it's in a different mimer, but I think it sheds a little clarity here. The question is, right, a person does an avera, and a person does something bad, and God responds. Well, that's why focus on the bad. Let's focus on the good. A person does something good. A person does a mitzvah. And God responds with love. And he rewards the person as described in Shema, right? He makes it rain and your crops grow. You do something good. You keep the covenant. You love God and keep his commands, and good things happen to you. This is not the whole Torah, but it is a part of the Torah, or sometimes we forget, right? So sometimes we explain it all away in such an abstract way that it sounds completely irrelevant. But then you read the Shema, and the Shema says, if you do good things happen to you. God rewards you, right? So, you have the person who does something good and God rewards them. Now the thing is that we know that God does not learn of the good things you do like a person does, right? God knows before you're going to do it that you're going to do it. He knows while you're doing it, he knows it as you know it yourself, better than you know it yourself. And after you've done it, he remembers it with perfect clarity. In other words, God does not really exist. God doesn't really learn things within time the way we do. God exists completely outside of time and knows things from within and in ways that we can barely begin to comprehend. And God does not learn of your actions and the good things you do as you do them. So the way we've been explaining it, so to speak, is that you do something good. This affects the realms of godliness. You affect God's expression. And from those same realms of expression, God responds in kind, right? And he acts towards you with kindness. This is the answer to the first question of our chapter. The first question was, how can it be that God, the unchanging, responds to the actions of the righteous and the wicked? To the righteous, he responds to them with love, and to the wicked, he responds with punishment, or whatever it is. And the answer is, very simply, that it's not he himself that's responding. On the contrary, it only reaches within the level of godliness. And as we explained, this itself makes sense, because to God, we are keloi chashiv. To God, the world is as if it doesn't exist. But to the godliness, on the contrary, the godliness exists to create the world. With regard in comparison to the godliness, we are teifes makom. We do take up space. With regards to the godly expression, the world does exist. The world is relevant. In other words, it fits with the nature of the godly expression that we should be able to affect it. So this entire relationship takes place within the godly expression. Now the question is, so what about God's foreknowledge of your action? Right? The way we've explained it, your relationship with the godly expression is that you do something good, God becomes aware of it, and then God rewards you. Right? So to speak, let's say, the godly expression seems to work relatively, almost it seems, within time or within some sort of limitation. I'm not saying that's literally what takes place. My point is that we know that there's other forms of God's knowing. When we say God is omnipotent, that's not the sort of thing, omniscient. When we say that God knows everything, that's not the sense in which we seem to mean it. Because this seems to imply that God knows things and rewards them like a parent would learn about something and reward a child. But we know that's not really true. We know that God also knows in a way where he's completely outside the entire system. He sees all time at once. He knows everything. He knows everything in one instant, right? Everything is revealed to him in one flash. Beskira achas, as it's called in the Kabbalah. With one glance, he sees everything from the beginning of the world to the end of the world. There's no learning of knowledge. There's no process, right, with God. When we speak of God's omniscience, we're not talking about something that's a process. On the contrary, we are talking about something that by dint of being God, he automatically knows everything. Now, it turns out that really there's two types of knowledge. Again, this isn't really in our mimer spelled out, but I think it's useful to understand. And really we've implied it. Really there's two knowledges. We could call them the active knowledge and the passive knowledge. There's God's involved in knowing, and then it's as if everything is known to him. We say this every day in davening. We say, Gali v'yadua. It is revealed and it is known in the passive sense. Not you know or you reveal, but it is revealed and it is known. In other words, just by you being God, everything in a passive sense is known to you. This is what's called sometimes, in some places, and it's actually quite a complicated topic. These are some of the more confusing ideas in Chassidus. This is what's called in some places Das Elyon, the higher knowledge, the higher perspective. The only reason I'm bringing it up is because it makes it much easier to understand what we're going to learn for the rest of the chapter. There's Das Elyon, there's the higher perspective. From the higher perspective, God knows everything. Gali v'yadua. It's what the question is asked. What he's learning now about what they do in Sodom. It took until that point in the biblical story where it says God heard the screams of Sodom to know that in Sodom there were bad people and now he was going to descend and destroy it. Of course, he knew everything already. Gali v'yadua. Everything is revealed before God. However, this is a passive knowledge. This is the knowledge by dint of him being God. If God is responding, if God is entering into a relationship with this action, such that he cares about the action, judges it as wicked, and responds to it, that does not take place in the Das Elyon. That doesn't take place in the passive knowledge of everything. Rather, it takes place in what's called Das Tachten. It takes place in the lower knowledge. And the lower knowledge is in the spheres. The lower knowledge is in the godliness, as we've been describing. And the lower knowledge is where there's this relationship, where you can affect it, and it affects us. And in this godly expression, in this lower knowledge, that's where God, so to speak, actively participates within the system. as opposed to Das Elyon, which is a perspective above the system.
So Hashgacha Pratis also dwells in this.
That's a good question. It's a complicated question. I don't know. The question is the
Explain what, translate what you said.
the individual divine providence, the fact that everything that happens in the world happens by God's will. I don't know. That's a very good question. I don't know.
But it's only related to our sphere, and so it's not related to God himself.
What do you mean?
I mean, everything that happens in our surrounding,
No, but if he created a system that if you do something good, he rewards you.
but not he.
Where's the Hashgacha Pratis? Is it the same realm?
But it's not he. It's the expression of him in our world.
No, but he's saying which one is it? He's saying is it Das Elyon or Das Tachton? Is it passive or is it active?
Well, it must be.
Hashgacha implies active, I would think, but I don't know. I don't know the answer to your question. I'm not going to answer the question.
Okay.
I don't know. So the first question of our chapter is as follows. Granted, I understand how God can have knowledge. I don't understand how that knowledge could actually be affected by something that's within the world. I thought that the world is as nothing before God, and God is not changed by the world. And the answer to that question is relatively, granted what we know already, relatively straightforward. Because the answer is that the changes that we make in God and the way in which we are relevant is exactly in proportion to how much we matter to Das Tachton, the lower knowledge, the spheres, the godly expression. To God Himself, you're right. The actions of the Ra'im tzedakta matiten lo. If you do correctly, what have you given Him? Right? If you sin, what have you taken away from Him? Right? Everything that exists is of no importance and is as relatively as if it is nothing to God Himself. However, in the godly expression, in the lower godly perspective, remember, this is not I'll mention. Okay, let me do it. Pardon me. So in the lower godly expression, at the level of the spheres, there, in the godly expression, is where this whole exchange takes place. Where if a good person does a mitzvah, God rewards it. If a bad person transgresses, then God punishes it. Right? These things take place all within the godliness, but do not affect God Himself. This is a relatively straightforward answer, once you understand that there's these two modes of expression. Now, note, it's important, that the Das Elyon and Das Tachton, the higher perspective and the lower perspective, the passive knowledge and the active knowledge, are not a godly reality versus the perspective of the creation. It's not that the higher knowledge is God's perspective and the lower knowledge is how we see things. On the contrary, this is two perspectives that God Himself has. These are two godly perspectives. It's not that God sees it one way and we see it another way. God chooses to see it two ways.
Even though they contradict. Which is possible there.
No, but it's not a raw contradiction. It's not like It's not like the ark taking up no space. That's a raw contradiction. This is not the opposite of logic. It seems to be that there's conflict. How can you have both? Okay, that's a question. That's a question about which Chassidus talks about a lot. How can you have both? Fine. How can you have both is a fair question. And the answer is not, you don't have to pull out the nimna nimnois and God can do anything just yet. There's answers before you have to get to that level, right? There's before you have to resort to so you could call it in the Senate they have a nuclear options. You could call it the Trump card. You could call it the Chassidic nuclear option, right? Where Mitch McConnell gets up and he says that nimna nimnois, that God can do anything. God is prevented from being prevented, and God is able to do absolutely anything He desires, which is true. But that's the nuclear option. So once you put this, just like in the Senate, once you put the nuclear option on the table, you can never go back. That's the whole problem. Right? The problem is that then they're going to use the nuclear option on you. And once you start answering every question with God can do anything, then there is literally no question in the world that has an answer. Right? We only pull out our nuclear option for special occasions, so when we really deserve it. An example of something within the world that took place where we pull out the nuclear option is that the ark in the Holy of Holies took up no space, right? And you might ask why that miracle in particular, why not the splitting of the sea? It's because the splitting of the sea is a miracle, but it's not a contradiction. You have water that lies flat, and then you have water that stands straight up. It's a miracle. What happened in the Holy of Holies was that the ark, which was built to exact specifications and to an exact size, specifically because it took up a certain size and was in fact the Ark of the Covenant as built to a specific measurement and was placed in the exact center of the room as God commanded, it was specifically because it was built to a certain size and placed in exactly the right place that it suddenly took up no space whatsoever. And if you measured from one side of the Ark to the end of the room and the other side of the Ark to the end of the room, you'd find that you had the full measure of the room. The Ark took up no space, as described in the Talmud. And the question is, how is that possible? Because it's not just that there's a miracle that it takes up no space, it's that it specifically takes up no space because it takes up space. Right? In other words, if you took the Ark of the Covenant and built it to exact specifications, but you built it 1 inch too small, and you put it in the Holy of Holies, no miracle would take place. The miracle is only taking place specifically because it's built to the correct specifications. So it takes up no space specifically because it takes up space.
But how do you know that?
How do you know what?
He was telling you to build it that size. You don't know what would have happened if it wasn't the same size.
Because then it's not the Aron. That's the Kedusha of the Beis HaMikdash. And the status of being the Aron is not Chal, in terms of the Lashon of Halacha. It doesn't fall, it's not halachically considered under Jewish law, and in reality it's not considered this vessel unless it's made to exact specifications. There's everything as a measure. Everything is a measure in the Beis HaMikdash. Everything is built very precisely. And it's specifically because it's built so precisely that it takes up no space at all. Right? So it's not really a miracle. Right? In a miracle you have nature and then nature is broken. Here you have nature and nature is broken, but nature is broken only because nature continues. It's both broken and existent at the same time. It's not a miracle. It's a miracle and a non-miracle at the same time. And you figure it out, right? That's nimna nimnais. That's God can do anything. There's no explanation for that. Yeah.
Once it was built properly, it became invisible. So
Not invisible.
Took up no space.
No, not invisible. Not invisible, but it took up when they say it took up no space, what they meant is that they knew the room was a certain size, and when they measured from one end of the ark to the right side and one end of the ark to the left side, they got the full size of the room. That's how it's described in the Talmud. So they would measure. In fact, if you think about it, it gets even more irritating because you could actually have let's say you have a yardstick that's exactly the length of the whole room, and you place it right next to the aron. So if you're looking on the yardstick to measure not the ark but to the sides, you would have the full length of the room. But if you were looking at the part of the yardstick that would measure exactly the aron, then you would have the size of the aron. Right? That sort of thing. If you want to take it to its logical conclusion. It's its illogical conclusion. Yeah, well said. In any case, that's nimna nimnais. That's the special occasion that we break out the nuclear option for. You know? So God can do anything. That's the explanation. On the contrary, that's the whole idea, that the holiest place in the world, if the holiest in the Holy of Holies, the holiest part of the temple, that only the holiest person can go into, the Kohen Gadol, in the holiest day of the year, on Yom Kippur, there should be a revelation of what God, so to speak, can really do, what only God can do. There should be a revelation not just of the breaking of nature, there should be a revelation of something which is actually completely impossible within the bounds of the world. A miracle is impossible, but what happened with the ark is a contradiction. It's impossible not because it never happens. It's impossible because it cannot happen. Right? That's the difference. Logical impossibility. Anyway, that's all a side point. So the answer to the question of how can God, I apologize for the long preface, hopefully it will help us. The difference between the answer to the question of how does the righteous affect God this way and the wicked affect God this way, if before him everything is nothing and he never changes, the answer is we don't affect God himself. We affect his lower perspective. We affect the lower way of seeing things, which is what we've been calling godliness, that there's an expression of God which is not God himself and is not a creation. And in that realm, in the spheres, in the realm of godliness, that's what our actions affect. And it is from that place that the godly response comes from, that God emanates kindness or he emanates severity into the world, and he, so to speak, interacts with what takes place within the world.
So is any of this in the Torah?
In the Bible, the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses?
Yes.
I don't know.
I mean, you'd think that, maybe in the prayers, but you'd think that this emanation,
Yeah.
that's sort of crucial to all of Judaism.
Not really, because as you find out if you learn any of these discourses to their end, and you actually find out what these Rebbeim want of you, the most crucial thing to Judaism is to do mitzvahs. That's the.
Well, maybe so, but in terms of
theology is
man's
not
relationship to God.
Yeah.
As we would like to understand it, you've said is that God is immutable, never changes.
It's not. We're not. The story's not finished yet. We're in the middle. Not yet. Because I'll explain why I'm saying that. Because the conclusion, when you step back and you look at the whole picture, sounds a lot more like what's in the Chumash than if you stop in the middle. Because basically all of this, as I've explained before, I'm not going to give my whole spiel now on the topic, but all of this is to understand the simple statements in the Chumash. All of this is to understand what does it mean, and when we say understand, we mean actually understand with all the powers that rationality can bring to bear, which raises all the questions that we've had in this discourse. To actually understand what it means when God takes the people out of Egypt with an outstretched arm. Or, for that matter, when God speaks to Moses, which happens, hundreds of times in the Chumash, right? To understand what any of that actually means, right? You can accept it on pure faith, which is perfectly fine and acceptable in Judaism, and that's basically that's fine in the eyes of the Chumash, so to speak, the simple reading of the text that is completely acceptable in Jewish practice. Or you can attempt to understand it, and it's the attempt to understand it that creates all of these problems. But the whole point is not to go on a whole diversion and create a whole system that seems to not be present in the Chumash. The point is, on the contrary, to actually explain what it says. As we've mentioned before in this discourse, the question, how can the Chumash call God wise, is a massive problem. That's a problem we've been dealing with for weeks and weeks in this class. Right? How can God be called wise? Rationally speaking, how's it possible? The problem starts with trying to understand it. The problem does not start with what the Chumash says. So we're halfway through trying to understand the simple statement that it says in the 5 books of Moses about all these sorts of things, about God's relationship with the world. So that's one way of answering that question. So that's the first answer. The first answer is the relationship between the wise and the wicked affects godliness, but it doesn't affect God himself. Then, last week, we made more problems. We made more problems for ourselves. Because that initial question of how can the righteous how can God respond to the righteous this way and to the wicked this way, that question is really a more superficial question. Then the Tzemach Tzedek says, but what if the person asking the question goes deeper? What if they ask a more difficult question? The more difficult question is as follows, that he, the very same God who is unaffected, and before whom everything is nothing, he is the same one who is choosing to have this lower perspective. He is the one, in other words, what's the language? He is the one who is He is the one. His essence, which is infinite and unchanging, is the one who contracts himself in order to shine a ray, to create this aspect of godliness from which he is able to be affected. In other words, this was all before. As we've explained, this whole idea of godliness, as we explained in an earlier chapter, I can't remember, it was a while ago. This aspect of godliness, how does godliness come about? How does the godly expression come about? Through a process called the tzimtzum. This lower perspective is only possible, right? Maybe I should have brought the whiteboard. This lower perspective is possible because God removes himself, right? We said, let's go back. We said there's 2 perspectives. There's a higher perspective and a lower perspective. There's das elyon and das tachton. There's the higher way of seeing things, of which God is totally unaffected by reality, right? Even though he knows everything, and is all powerful, etc. All those things work in, so to speak, a passive way. He's not actively involved in the creation. It's goli v'yadua. Everything is known to him simply because he's so high and so transcendent and so beyond everything. But he's not actively involved in the creation. This is the das elyon. This is his higher perspective. right? And then we said there's a lower perspective in godliness, where that's where he heard the cries of Sodom and rained down fire upon the city, right? The wicked did something bad, and God responded. That's in godliness. That's in a lower level of expression. What allows there? What mechanism, what spiritual, metaphysical mechanism allows there to be a higher perspective and a lower perspective? It's called the tzimtzum. The tzimtzum is the contraction in which he holds back his light and allows this lower perspective to exist, basically. What does it mean he holds back his light? We explained before in a very, it's more metaphorical, but it's in a sense very intuitive. What he's basically doing is he's holding back his sense of self, right? He's allowing there to be some sort of objective reality. And the truth is that with all of our caveats, really godliness and the spheros is not really a separate objective reality. It's really an expression of God, but it's all relative, right? Relatively speaking, right, just as we spoke about how the spheros, the lower perspective is infinite, but it's such a small infinity compared to God's true infinitude that it may as well be considered finite, right? It was another thing. That was another thing we said. So this lower expression is basically God allows there to be, to some degree, an objective reality. He allows there to be something, so to speak, outside of himself. Even though the spheres are not really outside of himself, and in fact are considered totally one with him and are an expression of him, nevertheless, he's withholding back his sense of self. There's room, at least, for there to be a difference there between chachma and bina, or chachma and chesed. There can be knowledge there, and there can be kindness there, and they can be two different things. This is itself a massive contraction, a massive removal of God's oneness. Because if God were shining there fully in all of his expression, like he were in his infinite light, there'd be no room for two different things to exist. All that would be there is I am God, an expression of himself entirely, one and unified. So there has to be, he withholds himself. He withholds his reality in order that this lower perspective can be created. Now the question is, the smart questioner isn't asking, how can it be that to a good person he does kindness, to a bad person he does wickedness? Obviously, there's the lower perspective. There's the das tachton. There's the lower perspective. There's after the tzimtzum. He's asking a deeper question. He's asking, it's God himself, of the higher perspective, God himself, the infinite God who is supposed to be unaffected by the world, that is the very God who chooses to actively create this tzimtzum, to actively contract himself, and to emanate this lower reality in which he's affected. In other words, you think you're getting out of this. You think that you're dodging this by saying it all happens in the godliness. The godliness is emanated at every moment from who? From the higher perspective, from God himself, before whom everything is supposed to be nothing and who did not change. So how can it be that we say that our actions affect only the spheres? The spheres are created by a tzimtzum actively at every moment from God, God himself, the one who's supposed to be unaffected. So then the question returns: so how can God be kind to the righteous and rain punishment down on the wicked, if in fact this comes from the realm of godliness, from the das tachton, and the das tachton is actively created by God himself at every moment? The godliness, the spheres are actively emanated by God at every moment. Right? That's the second question. Now, at the end of last week's class, in the 20 minutes we have left, the end of last week's class, we said that we gave a metaphor. Metaphors like this. We said it's like a father relates to his 1-year-old child. And the 1-year-old child, in order to educate the 1-year-old child, he's trying to teach the 1-year-old child something, like how to walk, we said, for example, or how to speak. We said, what does he do to educate the 1-year-old child? He shows them emotion. If they do something wrong, he's angry with them. If they do something right, he rewards them and he's kind with them and he gives them sweet nuts. He gives them candy, we said, right? So the father's expression is not elicited because the child is at such a level where it can actually evoke an emotional response from the father. Because the child, emotional response, we said at the very end of last week's class, is dependent on the seichel of the other person. It depends on how close you are relatively. And a 1-year-old child is not even in your world enough that it should really cause an emotional response from you with whether it does what you want or doesn't do what you want. It's a small child, right? It's like somebody that gets frustrated with an animal, right? It's like someone that gets frustrated. They don't have a mind. It's not that it's not that they're choosing with everything that they know and you're their loving parents and they appreciate you and everything, and yet they still don't do what you want when you're trying to teach them this thing. So on the contrary, 1-year-old child, what do they know? Where's their mind? So rather, what's your anger and your joy? Your anger and your joy is, in a sense, a show that you're putting on for your child, in a way. Right? It's in order for the child's benefit, in order for the child to benefit, you express to them either your anger or your love. That was the metaphor, right? Let's start reading the explanation of the metaphor with our 17 minutes left, okay? We're on page 248 in the English. V'al derech zeh yuvan l'mayla, the analog to the above. Top of page 248 in the English. It should be in the Hebrew, v'al derech zeh yuvan l'mayla. Probably near the bottom of the page in the Hebrew, chances are. Maybe not. I'm not sure. V'al derech zeh yuvan l'mayla. The analog to the above can be understood with regards to God, with regards to what takes place in the heavens. Shebe'emes ba'atzmusa yisbarich ein hanivrayim teifsim machem klal. In truth, in his very essence, the creation is not significant. In truth to God, the creation is not significant. Sheyachol aleim shemes pilus. That how they affect him should even be called affecting him. Just like the small child can't really be said to affect emotionally the father because the distance between them is too great. The truth is that everything in reality is as nothing, and these are three words for nothing, and they all mean a different thing in Chassidus. We're not going to go into it now, but they're not, they're nothing, and they're zero. You could translate, right? They're absolute, literally nothing before God. They literally have no relevance to him whatsoever. And why would God be affected by something which is not? You get affected by something that is. God's not going to be affected by something that's not. To him, everything that exists is not. It's kaloi chashivi. It's as if it is not. Don't ask the questions yet because it's more complicated than that. But to God himself, it's as if nothing exists. And now why would he be affected by something that does not exist? As we say, there is nothing which is outside of him, ki mimcha hakel, because from you, everything is from you, as it says in Divrei Yamim, in Chronicles 1. First Chronicles, I don't know how you translate it in English. Everything is from you. In other words, there's no existence aside from God. There's no reason why he should be affected by anything outside of him. Ach, rather, Shemaylim Ere Hagadol, he conceals his great light, umagala reshimu bilvad, and reveals only the trace, or only the remnant, Sheo inyan das hamitzumtzam, which is this lower knowledge, this das tachton, as we've explained it before. Yeah, I'm on page 251 now. We go left to right now, because I copied them backwards, don't forget. I copied them backwards and the page numbers are still wrong. I should say good... It's a good metaphor for life in general. He conceals his great light and reveals only his trace, which is this limited knowledge, the lower knowledge as we've been describing it. This is the spheres. Until, to the extent that there is able to be from this contracted reality, his palus al nivraim, he can act towards them. It's an active knowledge, right? As we explained before, that this active reality is created by the tzimtzum. So in other words, what is the reaction, and what is the interaction between us and Hashem? It's, so to speak, the lower reality that the father makes, in which he has an emotional relationship with the child, right? It's this das tachton, as I've been describing it, exactly as we've been saying. What is his relationship with them? He's mitzamtzem. He creates a tzimtzum. He limits himself. And this limitation allows for there to be an active relationship, a das tachton, a realm, a perspective from which the world is relevant, from which the world actually does exist. And from that perspective, there's able to be a relationship between him and the world. So far, we've said nothing that's new, in addition to my introduction. Everything should sound very familiar. The only thing that we've added is that this is like the metaphor of the father who who's not actually emotionally affected by the Son, but rather for the Son's benefit. In other words, because God wishes to create the world, basically, he makes as if he's affected, right, so to speak, which is what we're describing as the tzimtzum, right? Now, the explanation is not finished yet, because if the explanation ended here, it wouldn't really answer our original question, which is how can there be isn't he the one himself that's doing the tzimtzum? Doesn't that mean he's affected? Well, 1 second, there's more to the story. The im kain, if so, tiksha v'toimar. If that is the case, then the further question will be raised. Kamei shebemashal, ein ladas hamatzumtzam v'espilus sha'av marad b'nei mitzias klal. The limited reality which the Father shows to his Son is not a real existence at all. It's a show for the Son's benefit, so to speak. It has no reality with regards to the Father's higher perspective. Because the Father is not moved and affected by the actions of the 1-year-old in truth. He's only making himself to be affected. This act, in case I was unclear before, this act of making himself be affected is the tzimtzum. That's the tzimtzum. Because what is it? What's it for? It's for the result. It's for the receiver. It's for the Son. So God similarly makes the tzimtzum in order that there should be a receiver. He performs the tzimtzum in order there should be an objective reality. This that he makes himself to care, he makes it that the Son's actions should be real to him, is the same process as God contracting his light so that the world can be real to God in the lower perspective, in the spheres, in the godly expression. That's the metaphor. I should have said that more clearly. But the Father is not affected in truth, obviously. It's only he's making himself to care. He's making himself to have an emotional expression. Because before, let's go look at this, kame golui, it is revealed in the passive sense, before his adult knowledge, that the Son cannot affect him in any way. In other words, it's the same Father. It's the same Father who in his adult mind at that very moment knows that my Son cannot truly affect me. Rather, I am making myself to care. I am making myself a so to speak, an inner reality or perspective where my child's actions emotionally affect me. Just as, well, 1 second. And he knows, in other words, at the very moment that the Father is making himself react to the actions of the Son in an emotional way, the very moment when he's displaying joy that the Son followed his instruction, right? At that very same moment that he's doing that, he really knows that this joy that I'm making is not a real joy, and it is something that I am doing actively for the benefit of the Son. Because my son cannot affect me in an emotional way by himself. This is something which I'm actually doing. It's laying out the metaphor, is what we're doing, right?
But the fact that he played this game means that he cares. He doesn't.
On the contrary, that's the problem. One second. That's the problem. 1 second. The timer, shekamei kain lamaila, and we'll say the same is true above. I'm now at the top of page 250. The page numbers go down, but our understanding goes up, hopefully. The Torah will say that just as above, so to above. Ein la sfiras she'midas hanal mitzias klal. The spheres, which are God's emotional attributes, do not really exist. Ela shenira alenu kain. Rather, it only seems to us that it does. In other words, we're going deeper. We're asking the question now. We're not asking Ronnie's question, at least not yet. We're not asking that question yet. We're asking first an intermediate question, on the way to that question. We're asking, so the Father is really at the end of the day making make-believe with his Son. Right? He's basically making it up. It's not, if the Son weren't there, these emotions wouldn't exist whatsoever. The emotions are created only for the illusion, for the benefit of the Son. They're like an illusion. This seems to imply, if the metaphor is accurate, that the Tzemach Tzedek is saying. The Tzemach Tzedek is sort of, it's interesting. He's sort of making almost a dialogue, like in the philosophical sense of dialogue, right? He's saying what the student would say, in response to this answer. He's saying what the student would ask is, so are the spheres really not real? The student is questioning the metaphor. The student is saying, so God in his reaction, God when he shows, when he's happy towards the righteous, and he's angry towards the wicked, that's an illusion. Is that really created only for their benefit? Right? Is this something which he's only making up? That cannot be the case. However, this cannot be true. Because his thoughts are not our thoughts, and his ways are not our ways. Because when a person imagines in his mind to create something, to create some sort of being, whatever it may be, his thought has no effect. And his thought, basically, in terms of its effect on reality, it's as if it did not exist, ad sheyifal, until he acts. In other words, his thought is not active. His thought is passive. Right? In other words, his thought doesn't affect reality. Human thought is incomplete until action completes it. Right? In other words, if you plan to do something and don't actually do it in the physical world, that's an incomplete thought. It's an unfulfilled. It existed only in potential. It was never actualized. Right? You have to go out and actually do it with the medium of action. You have to go and you can't just think of building a house. You actually have to go out with your hammer and your nails and your wood, and you have to actually build it to actually get the house built. But that's not the case with his thoughts. Because when it arises in his will and his thought to create and to emanate, his thought is sufficient to create and to effect this emanation. And therefore, when he has the idea to contract his light, and to shine it in a contracted way, until there can be from this the levels of Chabad, in other words, the lower perspective, the godliness, Vespilus Hamidus, and God's affected emotional qualities, such as his kindness or anger, his happiness or anger, Kana, as mentioned before. Hine be'emes hayakein.
Like when he was creating the world in Shabbos, right? From the thought and not from the actual creation.
But what difference is
I don't know if that distinction is the right thing to draw here. Maybe.
Why do we care how much effort God made in order to create the world?
One second. Hine be'emes hayakein. So in truth, when God thought to create these things, it actually took place. V'nishavu metzias halaz, and this thing actually came into existence. V'hayaleh metzias, they actually did exist. And with regards to this, the analogy from the father to the son is not similar to the analog. Because in the example, the tzimtzum does not exist at all. Because the human intellect does not have the ability to actually create something. So this is the intermediary question. One second. It's like this. It's like this. It's like this. It's like this. The question, the explanation we give is how can God be affected by our actions? I thought we're like nothing to him. The answer is you're like nothing to him. It's like the 1-year-old child to the father. It's only that he makes it appear as if there's this relationship with you. In other words, das tachton. He creates the spheres. He creates this lower reality at which you do matter. Right? Just as a father in his mind has, so to speak, a lower reality in which the son's reactions affect him. Ask the student if when you give this answer, the question is, this implies that the spheres don't really exist. This implies that the lower perspective is an illusion. Lower perspective only exists in the eyes of the beholder. It only exists to the child. Because the child doesn't have the father's perspective, he thinks that these spheres exist, that his father's actually happy with him or angry with him, right? But in truth, the father knows that he's not really angry or happy with him, right? So the student is asking, what you're saying is that the spheres are not real. But the thing is, that's not possible. It's not possible that the spheres can't be real. Why? Because when God desires something to take place, it actually takes place. In other words, there's this idea which is called Enakeach Chaser Pearl Lamaila, that there's no potential without an actuality above, which is actually a very deep idea. But the general gist, at least for us here, is that when a person plans or wants to do something, when something exists in potential within a person, there's a gap between it existing in potential and the person actually actualizing it. With regards to God, there is no such gap. There's nothing exists in him in potential without being actualized. If there's a potential, if there's a plan, so to speak, it actually takes place. What he actually does is actually it becomes real.
But why does it make a difference on us?
Because the difference is
It's analogy.
the difference is because we're saying in the analogy, in the mashal, the father is putting on a show for his son, right? He says, "I'll pretend as if I'm joyous for him. So I'll contract my so to speak my adult mind. I'll get down on my son's level and I'll care about what he does." We're saying, but the father really knows that he's faking it. With regards to God, if God decides, so to speak, that he's making a tzimtzum, that he's contracting and limiting himself, and he's getting down on his son's level, this is not an illusion. One second.
To confirm. The question is,
It's okay, you can watch the
if
video.
so, how come the story when God told Moses, "I'm gonna eliminate your people," and it didn't happen?
No, that's
Because
not
he was
that's
arguing.
not the question.
No, this is a question that I have.
That's fair enough. Okay. 1 second. That's not the
If he
question.
thinks about
That's
something
not the
that
question
happens-
here, man.
No,
No what?
the problem is to think you need time. So there's no time up at that level. So
Not
therefore,
time. He told Moses, "I'm gonna destroy your people." When they
yeah, but it's very definite when he speaks. But it's not like he thinks about it, because there's no time to think
But he cannot
up
speak
at
without
that
thinking.
level. So he just
he
does.
can.
Yeah.
No,
He
but
just does.
maybe he thought and Moses knew it. Maybe he didn't say.
Yeah,
it.
but his thinking is doing the thing and and seeing the
But
result.
Moshe was able to argue with him to change his mind.
Yeah, but then again,
So to change
Except
your mind
that
means
happened-
changing the deed also? Change his mind.
No.
So it means changing the deed
but the
also?
funny
Because when he thinks in his mind,
No.
it happens.
Actually, it's easy, simple.
It's the
He knew in
execution.
advance that Moshe is going to argue and he's not going to do it anyway.
No, that's something else.
yeah, it's the upper and the lower levels.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the upper level thinks about it, the lower level executes. So if it doesn't get to the lower
Yeah,
level,
but
it doesn't get executed.
Yeah, but we cannot say that
So,
good thing to think.
so he has two parts
That's what we said. There's the upper levels.
of
And the lower
knowledge.
level.
Of knowledge.
Yeah, but so
Of
where's it all
knowledge.
coming from?
Huh?
Where does it all come from?
Yes.
It's like this. In the analogy, in the mashal, the tzimtzum does not really exist. There, the tzimtzum is an effect of the father's thought. In other words, the fact that the father thinks to put on a show for his son does not automatically mean that there's an actual contraction within his perspective, right? In other words, you have to actually the tzimtzum, this lowering himself down to his son's perspective, the making himself to care, like I was talking about it before. With regards to the analogy, the making himself to care doesn't have to be real. It doesn't have to be real because the way that the person's intellect works is that in the person's intellect he has a potential for something, and that potential is not immediately actualized. As opposed to in God, in godliness, when God creates the tzimtzum, when God creates the contraction, he has the intention to make himself to care, and that intention is certainly followed through. In other words, this that we may take from the metaphor, that it is only the Son that is perceiving that the Father has contracted himself, does not fit to the analog. The analogy is that in the analogy you might perhaps say that the Son only thinks that his Father is actually responding with kindness or whatnot, but he's not really. That this change didn't really take place within the Father. We're saying in the analog that's not really true. In the analog, when God contracts himself, this tzimtzum, when God lowers himself down to create the lower perspective, this is something that actually takes place. Like I said before, this is actually a second perspective that God himself has. This is not, so to speak, it's not a show. It's not something which only appears to be there because of the limited mind of the Son, as it may be in the metaphor. This is something that is actually and really there. I think that's what we're saying. I'm having a little difficulty here. 1 second.
So it's like parallel reality.
1 second.
What?
Parallel reality. It's the realities that coexist.
Can't be two realities.
Why not?
Because it can only be one reality.
Says who?
Yeah. So basically, the answer is that to God these are both valid perspectives. That's the answer. The answer is that to God these are both real. There isn't this idea of he's only thinking to lower himself down, and therefore therefore we perceive it as if he has lowered himself down to have a relationship with us. So on the contrary, if God conceives of doing it, so to speak, there's no unfulfilled potential above. So basically, when God lowers himself down to care, when he lowers himself down to have a lower perspective, that actually creates a new reality. It's not just from our perspective. In other words, it's God's perspective as well. I think that's the bottom line here. The language is troubling me a little bit, but I think that's basically the bottom line here. The bottom line is that from God's perspective, both of these things are real. Unlike in a human being, where you could say that it's only that it's really only the son's perception that it's real. By God, it's actually real. When God lowers himself down and God decides to have this tzimtzum, it has actually created a lower perspective and a lower reality, a lower way of seeing things, not just for us but for God as well.
His thoughts actually actualize.
That's right, because his thoughts actually make things happen as opposed to human thoughts. 1 second.
So he cannot even think like he think, or he doesn't need to think at all.
No, when he thinks
just
it
do
happens.
There's thinking and thinking.
Yeah, you.
There's two different things, right?
Realities is actually
It's like thinking of thinking.
It's one, right.
It's not really connected to thinking so much as the idea that there's nothing that exists in human potential that doesn't exist in actuality as well. Now the question is, the reason why when speaking to Moses is not really as much of an issue, I liked your answer as well, that he thought before he knew that Moses was going to complain. Maybe there is such an idea. I don't know if it's really said. I don't really know if it's really put in that perspective. With regards to tefillah, we say something like that. But there's an even simpler answer, which is that the actualization is not necessarily what we may think it may be. In other words, what's actual. It turns out that what's actual for God is not what we think of as actual. Our world does not add anything to actuality. On the contrary, our world is usually a subtraction. Our world is usually less real than what's an actual action for God. When we say that there's no potential to lack actuality, we're not necessarily talking about anything changing in our world. We You could be talking about things changing above. The point remains that they still have there's still this causal relationship between something which is potential and something which is actual. And by God, there's no difference between the two. If something exists in potential, that means it exists in actuality as well. There's no gap, so to speak. There isn't that limitation that a potential, that an action has to actually be made to take a potential into an actuality. On the contrary, the actuality is itself. Like I said before, this is not from the simpler ideas in Chassidus. This is from the advanced course stuff. I'm not going to claim to be
But actually, it's
an expert.
It is something which is built in. Like when God built us, He made it that we would seek Him. So it's like, it's already in the system. It's not like, he has to think and then, think again or do while you're thinking. Because this is already built in from day one. It's like we are programmed to seek for Him.
I don't know. It's a fair point. I have to think about
Seems
it.
like God.
I don't know if it's so simple.
Seems like reality is like an extremity. So
What we call reality.
what we call.
Yeah, our world, the
Otherwise,
physical
you think,
world.
If you touch something,
Yeah,
you feel it. You think you feel
you
it in
believe
your
you feel
fingers, right?
yeah.
But where does it really take place? In the brain,
Of course.
right?
You believe you feel it.
No, you feel it.
Well, we think we feel it here,
No, you don't. It's your brain.
No,
It's your
but it's
spine.
really
It's
taking
your-
But
place.
this is a sensory receptor. You feel it with your hand. If you have no hand, you're not going to be able to feel it.
So the initial answer, just 1 second, let me finish with this. The initial answer to the question, right? The question is, everything before him is supposed to be nothing. So how is it that he is creating this tzimtzum and he's creating a limited light such that he relates to the righteous and the wicked, right? The answer, I don't know if we've answered that question completely yet, but I think that the beginning of understanding the answer to that question is that really the question is on the tzimtzum. The question is on the nature of the tzimtzum. Right? The tzimtzum is real, we've basically just said. It's real to some extent, whatever. There's different types of being real. But the tzimtzum is something that God actually does. God actually does have a lower perspective from which the worlds are relevant and the worlds do exist and the worlds do affect it. There is such a thing. God actually does create the lower. And the question is how is he not affected? How is it that he's able to both do this and at the same time retain his higher perspective at which he knows that he's not really affected by anything. And our answer to the question is basically that the tzimtzum is real. Don't think that he's lying to himself, so to speak. The tzimtzum is real. He actually has this lower perspective. So the question now becomes, what's the nature of this tzimtzum exactly? When he's lowering himself down, when he's allowing himself to have this very real second perspective, how is that not really a contradiction to the higher perspective? How are you able to have a God who is both unaffected and at that same God is creating a perspective at which he's affected, right? So we haven't answered the question exactly. I don't know if we're ever going to answer the question until Mashiach comes. But that's not a very good selling point for the class. So we may not answer the question until Mashiach comes. But the beginning, the place to look for the answer to the question, I think that's the main takeaway from tonight. Until next week, where we're going to get into this. But the place to look for the answer is in the tzimtzum. What is this tzimtzum such that it's able to be actually two divine perspectives? The higher perspective, from which everything is nothing, and the lower perspective. Because we've just said that the tzimtzum is real. And the question is going to become, if the tzimtzum is real, then everything that the tzimtzum affects should also be real to him. That's really, our question has been restated. If the tzimtzum is real, if he actually contracts himself to have a lower perspective, then isn't everything that he's contracting himself to feel and to have a relationship with the world at the lower perspective, isn't all of that real to him as well?
But
what is the nature? This tzimtzum is real, so is not the reality of the tzimtzum what affects him? And that becomes the question for next week's class.
Why do we even care what's happening above the tzimtzum? Because, in any way,